All right, we're checking the questions on pages 123 and 129. So check your work as we go, and then we'll get a grade from these two pages together. All right, first of all, page 123. What military indefensible city did the Continental Army try to defend for reasons of politics and morale? What do you say, Hayden?
New York.
New York City. Yes, New York City. New York. Any question? And number two, why were the victories at Trenton and Princeton so important to the American cause? What do you say, Caleb?
Because they boosted morale for re-enlistment.
Right, that's a really concise way of saying it. Boosted morale for re-enlistment. Provided hope, you could have said something about that. But a lot of it was centered around the idea that we needed to re-enlist the guys that are there. Any question about your answer? All right, number three. Why was the Saratoga campaign the turning point of the war? You could have put a couple things here. What do you have, Lydia?
I had a whole British invasion was destroyed, and France recognized that U.S. was a nation and that we were serious about the war, so we joined the war against Britain.
Okay, good. That includes just about everything that you should have there. Certainly, probably the most important part of that may be that France joined us, but a part of that also was that the British force was eliminated, that a large part of the British Army was eliminated. All right, so do you have any question about your answer there? Good. I'll tell you what, if you have the elimination of the British force, you really should have both those things. So the defeat of the British in such a grand way, it would be 1 point, and the French recognizing the United States and joining us would be a second point. So that'll be worth 2 points. All right, any question now? So if you fail to put one of those down, you'll take off a point. Number 4, who was the drill master of the Continental Army? What do you say, Lahana?
Very much, Stephen.
Right. And the second part of that was the battle that demonstrated the success of his work. Steph?
That was Monmouth.
Right. So 2 points, one for Steuben and one for Monmouth. Any question? All right, number 5. Why were George Rogers Clark's victories in the Northeast strategically important? And we're going to talk about that today. You should have 2 reasons here. So give me one of the reasons, Alex.
Reduced Indian attacks.
Right. So that's one thing. And what's the second thing, Megan? Right. And we'll explain that a little bit further today. But those 2 things. All right. Everybody got it? Reduce Indian attacks and help the United States lay claim to the territory north of the Ohio River. Any questions? So there are 8 points on that page. Now we'll go to page 125. Is that right? No, 129. Page 129. What was the United States' worst defeat of the war? Brady.
I had Charleston.
Do you have a state where Charleston is located?
Virginia.
No. See, this is why we need to put the state. Charleston is the correct city, but there are other places, there's more than one place called Charleston. So where is Charleston, Joey?
South Carolina.
South Carolina. So if you fail to put the state, take off half a point. We need to know where these places are. And obviously, if we don't put the state, we don't know where they are. Charleston, South Carolina. Number 2, who was the leader of the band of patriot guerrillas in South Carolina? Haley.
Francis Marion.
Right, Francis Marion. And Francis is a guy, not a girl. Right? You have a question?
Yeah, from
Number 1. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I didn't have the state or place. I just had Lincoln serving his entire course.
Oh, okay, you described it. Okay. I can see where you might have interpreted the question that way. All right, back to number 2. Francis Marion's nickname was what, Sarah? Swamp Fox. Yeah, we'll talk about him today too. 2 points for number 2, for obvious reasons. Number 3. Why was it so important for General Greene to reach the Dan River before the British? Sophia.
Those important because it's the problem of women with the cut off the British pursuit and after the loss the Americans have reelected the British.
Okay, so Joey, what do you have?
Would stop the British pursuit.
Okay, that's pretty simply put. It would stop the British from chasing after him. Michaela?
And they had to reach the dam first to escape from losses.
Okay, yeah, that's same thing and a little bit differently. All right, so everybody have that? Any question about your answer? 4. What admiral helped trap Cornwallis at Yorktown? This is always an interesting answer. Let's see. Who haven't heard from yet? I think we've heard from everybody, haven't we? All right, we'll let Joey take a shot at it.
Admiral de Grasse French.
And the nationality is also part of the question, and he was French.
Yeah.
How many of you had Admiral de Grasse?
Oh,
We got the rest of you. The rest of you had Marquis de Lafayette, didn't you? Someone who had the correct answer, tell them why that's not accurate. Why was it not Lafayette?
Was he not an admiral?
He was not an admiral. Lafayette was fighting on land. An admiral was on sea.
Oh, I didn't tell you that.
Admiral de Grasse and French. Okay, so that's 2 points as well. 6 points on page 129. So add up the total amount that you have incorrect, put that at the top of your page, and circle it. And somebody put /14, so I remember how many points there are. Caleb.
I had that he was French, but I had Marquis de Lafayette.
Well, so you got 1 out of the 2 points.
Yeah, okay.
There's 2 points on that one. 1 for the name, 1 for the nationality. So you lucked out and had the right nationality. Any questions? Any other questions? Okay. If you have the number of points off duly counted, pass them back to Brady and he will place them on the desk there for me to collect and I will record them. Now let's get to the end of early campaign. The last thing we talked about was the Battle of Monmouth, which was not a victory for the Americans in that they did not defeat the British, but in what way was it a victory? Because of the casualties, yeah. Some of you that took world history, which is all of you, may remember the term, although I'm not holding my breath that you'll remember, the term for when you have a victory but it cost you so much it wasn't worth it. Even though the British didn't have a victory here, it reminds me of that. You remember what it's called when you have so many casualties but you technically won the battle? It's named after the guy who brought elephants over to Italy and fought against Rome.
Oh, Hannibal.
Not Hannibal.
Not Hannibal.
No, this guy came from Greece. He was called in by Greek colonists of southern Italy. He came over and he won several battles. And one, he said, if I have any more battles like this, I won't have any men left or something like that. His name was Pyrrhus, and it's called a Pyrrhic victory. Okay, so just a little flash from the past. All right, let's continue on now to consider what happens next after the Battle of Monmouth. Remember, that's where we had the story of Molly Pitcher. We want to go out west. Now, we have to, backing up a little bit, but we have to do that in order to have some consistency here in the story of the West. George Rogers Clark is the man that we are looking at here. And from Kentucky, which was part of Virginia at that time, he took 175 men to Illinois. And I'll show you the map in a moment. I want to show you first why. In July 1777, 15 bands of Indians were sent by the British from Detroit to raid the frontier settlements. And the man who did it was Colonel Hamilton. He was in charge of the British fort in Detroit, and he sent out Indians to go and wipe out whatever colonists they could find. And as incentive, he said, if you bring back their scalps, I'll pay you. So Hamilton is the reason why George Rogers Clark heads out into Illinois. George Rogers, and here's a painting that someone did of some Native Americans and Indians that are preparing to attack colonists. And here's another painting of colonists being attacked. As you can see here, not waiting for him to even be dead, just get that scalp because that's what you get paid for. And of course, when you're turning in scalps, no one cares how old the person was. It's a hunk of hair. So men, women, children, doesn't matter. Hamilton, the hair buyer, would pay you for it anyway. So this is what happens. Clark starts over here. He actually gets some supplies in Pittsburgh, comes down the Ohio River, and all the way out to Illinois. He is in the red at the beginning here from Fort Pitt. George Rogers Clark described the dark days of this initial going out into Illinois like this. No people could be in a more alarming situation. Detached at least 200 miles from the nearest settlements of the states, surrounded by numerous nations of Indians, each one far superior to ourselves in numbers and under the influence of the British government and pointedly directed to destroy us. George Rogers Clark decided to use guerrilla tactics in this part of the United States, as we might call it, in an area that was known for its massacres, scalpings, and ambushes. So first he goes to Kaskaskia, which is here. You might see it a little clearer on this map. There's Fort Pitt, it's on the Ohio River, out to Kaskaskia. Clark marched his men then from Illinois overland to the Mississippi River, you can see here. To the town of Kaskaskia. It's down here from here to the Mississippi River to Kaskaskia. That's later. He marches there, and it was a town populated mostly by French settlers who didn't really care much for the British. And the fort surrendered without a shot on July 4th, 1778. So, with that in mind then, he goes overland to the fort at Vincennes, and once they heard what happened to Kaskaskia, they also surrendered. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton did not like hearing about his forts coming into the hands of the Patriots, and so he comes from Detroit down, and he recaptures Vincennes. And then he was going to wait till spring to go over to Kaskaskia and retake that. Well, George Rogers Clark decides he's not going to wait till spring and try to defend the fort. He's going to go back to Vincennes and retake it from Hamilton. And so that's what he endeavors to do. In early February 1779, Clark and his men marched the 240 miles to Vincennes through wet, flooded plains. There was water. They were wading through water. It was cold. They were wading waist deep in freezing water. They ran out of food and resorted to eating rats. Men from Clark's unit threatened, we're talking about just leaving. Clark had to threaten to shoot them to keep them going. And eventually they reached Vincennes on February 23rd. And at that point they had not eaten in 2 days. not exactly the situation you want your fighting men to be in to attack a fort, right? Well, Clark had to carry out some deception in order to be successful, and so this is what he did. He had his men carry flags and march back and forth outside the city, outside the fort, in order to fool Hamilton into believing that there were many more men than he really had. It reminds me of Gideon. Remember how Gideon was reduced down to 300 men, and each one of them had a pitcher with a lamp in it and a trumpet. And when they broke the pitcher, so that all of a sudden lights appeared all around the Midian camp and heard trumpets blowing. Well, you figure for every trumpet blowing, every light, there's probably hundreds of men in addition to that. And the Midianites didn't know that's all there were. And so they freaked out and started fighting one another. Well, the same thing kind of happens here. You know, he sees all these men marching around with flags. Well, you assume that's just the color guard, that there's a whole lot more men behind them. And so this trick, the constant they fire their guns in different places, and that convinced Hamilton to surrender the fort without a fight. He thought Clark had 500 men because of all the noise and the parading on different streets. The townspeople thought he had 1,000 men. He only had 150. And the British surrendered. The significance of this surrender is twofold. One, you've already answered this in your questions. One, it reduced Indian attacks because Hamilton's no longer in a position to pay them. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, it helped lay claim to the territory north of the Ohio River after the war. If you think about it, if Clark had not done this, when the United States does eventually get their independence from Great Britain, we would not have received Ohio and anything west. We might still be part of the British Empire. We might be part of Canada today if Clark had not done this. And we'd have to say things like, hey, so very important. Neither the governments of Virginia nor the United States, unfortunately, would reimburse Clark for his the use of his own money to supply his troops. And that was because he wasn't a very good bookkeeper. He didn't keep his receipts. You know, your parents ever have problems with that? Can't find the receipts. Well, creditors eventually seized most of the land grants that were given him. So he went into poverty, and as a result, became an alcoholic and was such an unpleasant man that his brother, William Clark, you maybe know him from Lewis and Clark later on, wouldn't even come to see him. He died at his home near what is today Clarksville, Indiana, in 1818. All right, next we come to the Great Disappointment, Benedict Arnold. Remember him? Benedict Arnold had acted heroically throughout the early years of the war. He was joint commander with Ethan Allen at Fort Ticonderoga, remember? He was wounded while bravely supervising a night attack on Quebec. He prevented the British plan of dividing New England from the rest of the colonies by building ships and taking them out onto Lake Champlain. He had broken his leg in the fall of his horse while leading a charge that shattered the British lines, turning the tide at Saratoga. I mean, all of these things he had done, and yet he never got any recognition. This latter injury seemed to require amputation, but it eventually healed, although that leg was left 2 inches shorter than the other. Continually passed over for promotion and recognition by the Continental Congress, Arnold sought glory and wealth with the British, secretly offering to assist them in 1779. He wrote to Washington in 1779, in May of that year, that he had, quote, little expected to meet the ungrateful returns I received from my countrymen. He was hurt. But he was apparently motivated by greed as well as by disillusionment. according to the correspondence with British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton. Allen had recently married a 19-year-old Peggy Shippen, who came from a very well-to-do family, and she had expensive tastes. So not only is Arnold, not only is Arnold hurt over the situation of not receiving recognition, but now he needs money to keep his new wife in her habits. And her family was also strongly connected to British sympathizers. They were loyalists. An interesting side note, by 1779, there were more Americans fighting with the British than there were with Washington. There were no less than 21 regiments of loyalists in the British Army. Don't often hear about that, do we? Washington reported a field army of 3,468, whereas the loyalists in the British Army were between 6,000 and 8,000. And about a third of Americans opposed the war altogether. Well, in 1760, Washington sought to honor Arnold by giving him command of a section of the Continental Army. But by now, the secret agent Arnold astounded Washington by requesting instead the command of West Point, an important fort on the Hudson River. He had already plotted to turn the fort over to the British for 20,000 pounds. If you look at the map here, you will see that West Point is located on a bend of the river, and they also have placed a huge chain across the river so no boats could get through unless they lowered the chain. So it's a very important part. And from here you can see up the river and down river very easily. It's on a high point, and because of the curve of the river you can see a long ways in both directions. So it was a strategic fort, and Arnold planned to give it over. His contact was Major General John Andre, who is shown here. And he was captured with incriminating papers in his boot after a secret meeting with Arnold. Arnold was able to escape from his home, which was, interestingly, across the river. Arnold's home was over here. And Washington came to inspect the fort, came to visit Arnold about that same time. Well, at the same time. Andre had just left and was captured. Washington didn't know about that. Washington shows up at the fort, kind of inspection. He found it in disrepair. Arnold had not done what he should have to get the fort ready for any kind of attack. He found lots of things wrong with it. Arnold wasn't there to greet him. So where is Benedict Arnold? So one of the guards finally said, well, he took a rowboat over to the other side earlier. And so Washington and the people with him went over there. And by then, Arnold had had heard that Andre had been captured. And so he was gathering all he could to get away. And he did. He got away just before Washington arrived. But his wife, Peggy Shippen, Arnold, was left behind. And so when Washington arrived at their home, usually the lady of the house would greet them and so on. Well, she never came down. And Washington's getting a little perturbed. You know, what's going on here? And the servants kept making excuses. Finally, Washington just went up and burst into her bedroom, and she started acting like she was crazy, like going from weeping to screaming, and and just acting like she had lost her mind. It pretty much convinced Washington that she was crazy, so he left her alone, and eventually she was able to leave and go join her husband. But this is it's a very interesting story of all the things that happened. I can't tell you all of it, but you might want to be interested to look it up. So Arnold got away. He got to the British ships that were down the river a little ways. Andre had been captured. Arnold soon returned to action as a British general. They rewarded him, making him a general, and he led a new assault on Virginia, leading to the capture of Richmond. While he was there, he asked a captured American officer how he would be treated if the Americans captured him. The officer replied that Arnold's left leg would be cut off and buried with military honors, but the rest of his body would be hanged. Interesting. In fact, if you go to Saratoga, I have not been there yet, I hope you go someday, there is a monument there to Arnold, which contains no likeness of him. It doesn't even have his name. There's simply a boot representing the leg injury that Arnold suffered at the battle. The dedication reads in part, "To the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army," but it doesn't name him. Arnold also led an attack later on Fort Trumbull near New London, Connecticut, where he slaughtered the colonel commanding the fort. He then ordered that all 105 of the surrendering troops be killed. Following this, he set fire to the town of New London. It's almost like he was getting revenge for his slights. Although devastated by Arnold's portrayal, Washington was able to understand something extremely encouraging. The illumination of the treachery was an indication of the proactivity of God on behalf of the patriot cause. A very interesting story surrounding the capture of Andre, too, of what took place. He tried to trick them. Actually, these soldiers were not dressed in American uniform, so he thought they were British, and so he's acting one way, and then when he found out they weren't, then he tried to pretend like he was just doing that because he thought, and it's a whole interesting story of what takes place there. But Washington felt that this whole thing had been discovered because God had brought it about. Washington declared that the treason has been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to it affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the object of divine protection. Pretty amazing statement. As Glenn Beck puts it in his book about Washington, a turncoat may have been in their midst, but so was God. After the war, Arnold returned to Britain with Cornwallis, where he lived comfortably, being given a pension in addition to his reward. But he was shunned by British society. People don't like a traitor, even if it was a traitor for your side. He died unhappy in London in 1801 at the age of 60. As death approached, Arnold requested that his old Continental Army uniform coat be draped on his shoulders, saying this, "Let me die in this old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for wearing any other." Pretty sad ending. Well, wasn't so happy for Andre either. Andre has an interesting history before this, which I'm not going to take time to go into. He was well liked by everyone, even the Continental Army soldiers that were in charge of guarding him came to really like him. He was a likable fellow. And so there were many that wanted him to be given back to the British. And in fact, Washington offered to give Andre, make a trade, Andre for Arnold. But the British wouldn't do that because they had made an agreement with Arnold and they felt that they couldn't betray that trust. Well, because of what happened to Nathan Hale, the Continental Congress had passed a law saying that anyone captured as a spy from the British would also be hanged, just like they had done to Hale. So Washington's hands were essentially tied. Although he didn't want to hang Andre, he felt he had to in order to fulfill what the Continental Congress had said. Andre even asked, can you shoot me as a gentleman? To be hanged was something that was done to common criminals. Can you at least just shoot me? And Washington said, no, I can't do that. And so he eventually was hanged. This is what George Washington said. He was more unfortunate than criminal, an accomplished man, and a gallant officer. The admiration that even Americans felt for him can be seen in this poem that was written. Now Arnold to New York has gone, a-fighting for his king, and left poor Major Andre on the gallows for to swing. Andre was executed. He looked both meek and mild. His face was fair and handsome, and pleasantly he smiled. It moved each eye with pity, and every heart there bled, and every one wished him released, and Arnold in his stead. He was a man of honor. In Britain he was born. To die upon the gallows most highly he did scorn. And now his life has reached its end, so young and blooming still. In Tappan's quiet countryside he sleeps upon the hill. Well, Andre became a hero in England as well. After the war, a monument was erected to his honor in the Heroes' Corner of Westminster Abbey, where his remains were brought from America and reburied in 1821. Another monument was erected in 1879 on the site of his execution in New York, where that quote by Washington is inscribed. So some of the sad things that happened in war. Okay. Next, we want to move to the war in the South, the new plan for the South. What happens is the British decide, since the plan they had of dividing New England from the rest didn't work, what they decided to do is we're going to go in the South and establish a presence there. And the reason is because the South has more loyalists than any other part of the country. And so they figured they would go there, and as they're going along fighting against the Patriots, they would pick up more and more of the Southerners along the way, and the army would swell, and then they would be able to have the South cutting off the rest of the colonies. So that's what they're attempting to do. This plan didn't work. It was a failure, and so they're going to try something different. Here are the major battles that take place in the South. You can see all the way from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and we're going to end up in Virginia at the final battles. All right, so I need to switch to a different set of slides to continue, and we have a couple minutes so we can get started on the war in the South, or maybe not. So tomorrow we will do the war in the South. Tomorrow, oh no, that would be Friday. Tomorrow our reading project reports we'll do in class. So Friday we'll do the war in the South, and you need to do the content questions on page 131 for Friday. Tomorrow we'll do reading projects. Friday we'll check the content questions, cover the war in the South, and then we'll give you a take-home test on Friday to take home for the weekend.